The autumn rain drummed against my apartment window in downtown Seattle as I balanced my laptop on my knees, reviewing quarterly reports for the marketing firm where I'd worked for the past 8 years. At 32, I'd built a comfortable life for myself, a decent salary, a cozy one-bedroom apartment with a view of Pike Place Market, and enough savings to finally consider buying my own place. My phone buzzed with an unknown number from my hometown of Spokane, and something in Nawensiao, my gut told me to answer it. The voice on the other end was shaky, unfamiliar at first, until I realized it was Mrs. Henderson from next door to my childhood home. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones about seeing my parents at the bank that morning with my younger sister Rebecca, all of them looking serious and carrying thick manila folders. Mrs. Henderson had always been the neighborhood's unofficial information hub, but today her gossip felt different, weighted with genuine concern. She mentioned overhearing something about paperwork and signatures, though she couldn't make out the details from her position in the adjacent teller line. The way she described my father's posture, hunched and defeated, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with Seattle's October weather. I thanked her politely, but my mind was already racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. After hanging up, I stared at my phone for several minutes, debating whether to call my parents directly or let whatever was happening play out naturally. My relationship with my family had been complicated since I'd moved to Seattle after college, choosing career advancement over staying close to home like Rebecca had. She'd married her high school sweetheart, had 2 kids by 25, and lived just 10 minutes from our parents in the same modest neighborhood where we'd grown up. While I sent birthday cards and visited during major holidays, Rebecca was the one who helped with grocery shopping, took Dad to doctor appointments, and had family dinner every Sunday. The guilt of that distance had always gnawed at me, especially as my parents entered their 70s and began showing signs of needing more support. Mom's arthritis had worsened significantly, making simple tasks like opening jars or climbing stairs increasingly difficult for her. Dad's memory had started showing gaps, nothing alarming enough for a diagnosis, but enough to make us all quietly worried about what the future might hold. I'd assumed Rebecca was handling things, and perhaps I'd been too comfortable letting her take the lead while I focused on building my career 300 miles away. My laptop screen had gone dark while I sat lost in thought, and when I touched the trackpad to wake it up, the quarterly report seemed suddenly insignificant. Something was happening with my family, something important enough for Mrs. Henderson to track down my number and call me directly. The rain outside had intensified, matching the growing storm of anxiety in my chest as I realized I might have to face some uncomfortable truths about how disconnected I'd become from the people who mattered most. I closed my laptop, knowing I wouldn't be able to concentrate on work until I understood what was going on back home. The drive from Seattle to Spokane would take about 4 hours, but something told me this wasn't a situation that could wait for the weekend. I'd been putting off using my vacation days anyway, always finding reasons to stay busy with projects and client meetings. My supervisor had been encouraging the entire team to take more time off, especially those of us who hadn't used our allotted days from the previous year. As I scrolled through my contacts to find my parents' number, I wondered why they hadn't called me themselves about whatever was happening at the bank. Rebecca and I had never been particularly close, despite being only 3 years apart in age. She'd always been the responsible one, the daughter who made practical choices and stayed within the familiar boundaries of our small city. I'd been the restless one, always looking toward bigger cities and broader horizons, perhaps selfishly prioritizing my own ambitions over family obligations. The thought that something significant was happening without my knowledge felt like a betrayal, though I couldn't decide if I was more hurt by being excluded or angry at myself for not being present enough to notice signs of trouble. My fingers hovered over Dad's contact information, but I hesitated to press call. Part of me was afraid of what I might learn, and another part was ashamed that a neighbor had to be the one to alert me to my own family's crisis. The rain continued its steady percussion against my window, and the city lights below began to blur as evening settled over Seattle. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling first, I would drive to Spokane tonight and see for myself what was happening with my family. I threw some clothes into an overnight bag, sent a quick email to my supervisor requesting emergency family leave, and grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter. The drive ahead would give me time to think, to prepare for whatever conversation awaited me in my childhood home. As I locked my apartment door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover just how much my absence had cost me and how much my family had been handling without me. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt longer than usual, each floor marking my transition from the independent life I'd built to the family responsibilities I'd been avoiding. Mrs. Henderson's phone call had been a wake-up call in more ways than one, forcing me to confront the possibility that while I'd been building my career, my family had been making decisions that would affect all of us. The autumn night stretched ahead of me, full of uncertainty and the promise of difficult conversations that could no longer be postponed. Interstate 90 stretched endlessly before me as I left Seattle's city limits, my Honda Civic cutting through the darkness while my mind churned with possibilities about what I might find in Spokane. The radio played softly in the background, but I barely heard the music over the sound of my own thoughts racing through worst-case scenarios. Had Dad's memory issues progressed more than any of us realized, requiring legal interventions I knew nothing about? Was Mom's health declining faster than she'd let on during our brief phone calls, necessitating arrangements for long-term care that would require selling the house? The familiar landmarks of my monthly drives home, the outlet malls in North Bend, the steep grade warning signs as the highway climbed through Snoqualmie Pass, felt different tonight, weighted with urgency and dread. I'd made this journey dozens of times over the past decade, usually for holidays or obligatory family gatherings, but never with this sense of rushing toward a crisis that had been unfolding without my knowledge. My phone sat silent in the passenger seat, and I fought the urge to pull over and call Rebecca directly, demanding answers about what had happened at the bank. The mountain pass was nearly empty at this hour, with only occasional long-haul truckers sharing the dark highway with me. As I navigated the winding curves through the Cascade Mountains, I found myself remembering the last time I'd had a real conversation with my parents, not the surface-level check-ins about work and weather, but an actual discussion about their plans, their concerns, their needs. The realization hit me that I couldn't pinpoint when that conversation had taken place, and the shame of that recognition sat heavy in my chest. Rebecca had always been better at the day-to-day maintenance of family relationships, content to build her life in the same zip code where we'd grown up. She'd married Tom right after high school, and they'd settled into a comfortable routine of barbecues, school events, and Sunday dinners at Mom and Dad's house. Their kids, Emma and Jake, were now 7 and 5 respectively, and I knew from Mom's occasional updates that they spent almost as much time at their grandparents' house as they did at home. I'd convinced myself that my absence didn't matter much since Rebecca was handling everything, but tonight I wondered if that had been a convenient lie I'd told myself to avoid feeling guilty about my choices. The highway began its descent towards the Columbia River, and I could see the lights of small towns scattered across the valley below. This part of Washington state felt like a different world from Seattle's urban energy, slower, more rooted, less forgiving of people who chose to leave and build lives elsewhere. I'd never regretted my decision to move to the city, but as I drove through the landscape of my childhood, I wondered if my parents had interpreted my absence as rejection, rather than simply the natural progression of a young person seeking opportunities. My gas tank was getting low, so I pulled off at a truck stop in Ellensburg, a college town about halfway to Spokane. The fluorescent lights of the gas station felt harsh after hours of highway darkness, and I squinted as I filled my tank and grabbed a coffee from the convenience store. The clerk was a young woman about my age, and I found myself wondering if she'd stayed in this small town by choice or circumstance, whether she ever thought about what life might be like in Seattle or Portland or any of the bigger cities within driving distance. Back on the road with my coffee growing cold in the cup holder, I tried to piece together clues from my recent conversations with family members. Had there been signs I'd missed during our last phone call 3 weeks ago? Mom had mentioned something about paperwork and appointments, but I'd been distracted by a client crisis and hadn't pressed for details. Dad had seemed more confused than usual when I'd spoken to him briefly, asking me twice about my job and whether I was still living in the same apartment. At the time, I'd attributed it to normal aging and the chaos of having grandchildren visiting. The radio had shifted to late-night talk shows, and I listened absently to callers discussing their problems with family and money and relationships. One woman called in about caring for aging parents while managing her own career and family, and her words hit uncomfortably close to home. She talked about the guilt of living far away, the burden placed on siblings who stayed local, and the financial complications that arose when elderly parents needed more care than they could afford. I turned off the radio, preferring silence to the echo of my own situation reflected in a stranger's voice. As I passed the exit for Yakima, I realized I was less than 2 hours from Spokane and still had no clear plan for how to approach my family about whatever had happened at the bank. Should I confront them directly about Mrs. Henderson's call, or try to gather information more subtly? Would they be angry that I'd come unannounced, or relieved that I was finally showing up when they might need me? The closer I got to home, the more uncertain I felt about my role in whatever family drama was unfolding. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. as I saw the first signs for Spokane, and I wondered if my parents would even be awake when I arrived. They'd always been early to bed, early to rise people, but stress had a way of disrupting even the most established routines. I decided to drive by the house first, see if any lights were on, and make a decision about whether to knock on the door tonight or wait until morning. Either way, I was about to step back into family dynamics I'd been successfully avoiding for years, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what that might unleash. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered as I navigated the route to my parents' house at nearly midnight. Maple Street had always been lined with modest post-war homes, each with small front yards and detached garages, the kind of solidly middle-class area where neighbors knew each other's names and children played outside until dark. Most of the houses were dark now, their residents long asleep, but I noticed several for-sale signs that hadn't been there during my last visit 6 months ago. The economic downturn had hit Spokane harder than Seattle, and it seemed like more families were being forced to make difficult decisions about their housing. My parents' house sat in the middle of the block, a small 2-bedroom ranch with the same beige siding and brown trim that had defined my teenage years. Dad had always kept the lawn meticulously maintained, taking pride in having the greenest grass and most precise hedge lines on the street. But as I parked across the street and studied the house in my headlights, I could see that the landscaping had become overgrown and neglected. The hedge that separated their property from the Hendersons had grown wild and uneven, and there were brown patches in the lawn that Dad never would have tolerated in previous years. The house itself was completely dark, not even a porch light left on, which was unusual for my security-conscious father. He'd always been the type to leave lights on timers and check the locks twice before bed, habits formed during his 30 years working night shifts at the aluminum plant. The darkness felt ominous somehow, as if the house itself was keeping secrets. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, trying to decide whether to wake them or wait until morning. Mrs. Henderson's house next door showed a single light in what I remembered was her kitchen window, and I wondered if she was waiting to see if I would actually show up. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Rebecca, all within the past hour, but no voicemails. The timing seemed too coincidental. Had Mrs. Henderson called her too, warning that she'd contacted me? Or had my parents discovered something was missing and realized they needed to reach out to me before I found out from other sources? I considered calling Rebecca back, but something held me back. If there was family drama unfolding, I wanted to hear it directly from my parents rather than filtered through my sister's interpretation of events. The October air was crisp when I finally turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, carrying the overnight bag I'd hastily packed in Seattle. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood at night, distant traffic from the highway, the hum of air conditioning units, a dog barking several blocks away, brought back memories of summer evenings, spent on this same street as a teenager. But those nostalgic feelings were overshadowed by anxiety about what I might learn in the morning. The Henderson house seemed to be watching me as I approached my parents' front door, and I could almost feel Mrs. Henderson peering through her curtains. I used my old house key, surprised when it still worked in the front door lock, and stepped quietly into the living room that had remained virtually unchanged since my high school graduation. The same floral couch sat facing the same console television. Family photos in identical frames lined the mantelpiece, and Mom's collection of ceramic figurines occupied every available shelf surface. But something felt different, emptier somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify what was missing. The familiar smell of my father's pipe tobacco and my mother's lavender air freshener should have been comforting, but instead it emphasized how much of an outsider I'd become in my own childhood home. I made my way carefully through the dark hallway toward the spare bedroom, where I'd stayed during previous visits, avoiding the creaky floorboard outside my parents' bedroom door. The guest room had been my old bedroom until I left for college, and Mom had converted it into a combination sewing room and storage space, with a narrow twin bed pushed against one wall for occasional visitors. As I set down my bag and felt around for the bedside lamp, my hand brushed against a stack of papers on the nightstand that definitely hadn't been there during my last visit. Even in the dim light, I could see that the papers were official documents. Legal. Forms with letterheads from banks and law offices, the kind of paperwork that accompanied major financial transactions. My heart rate quickened as I recognized the logo of First National Bank, the same institution where Mrs. Henderson had seen my family that morning. The temptation to read through the documents was overwhelming, but I forced myself to leave them alone and get ready for bed. Whatever secrets these papers contained, I would learn about them properly in the morning, through honest conversation rather than middle-of-the-night snooping. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and my own racing thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. Every creak and whisper seemed amplified in the darkness, and I found myself listening for signs that my parents were awake and aware of my presence. The twin bed was smaller than I remembered, and I spent most of the night curled uncomfortably, on my side staring at the faint outline of those papers on the nightstand. By dawn, I'd rehearsed a dozen different ways to broach the subject of what had happened at the bank, but none of them felt adequate for what I suspected might be a conversation that would change our family forever. The first light of morning filtered through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the familiar walls of my childhood bedroom. I could hear the coffee maker in the kitchen beginning its automatic cycle, a sound that meant my parents were following their usual routine despite whatever upheaval they might be experiencing. As I lay there gathering courage for the conversations, ahead I realized that coming home unannounced might have been impulsive, but it was also long overdue. Whatever was happening with my family, whatever decisions had been made without my input, it was time for me to stop being a distant observer and start being a daughter who showed up when it mattered. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted down the hallway as I emerged from the guest bedroom, having spent 20 minutes staring at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror, trying to prepare myself for whatever conversation awaited me in the kitchen. My parents had always been early risers, and the familiar sounds of their morning routine, Dad's heavy footsteps crossing the linoleum, Mom's gentle humming as she moved between stove and counter, felt both comforting and ominous. I'd decided to act as if my unexpected arrival was perfectly normal, avoiding any mention of Mrs. Henderson's phone call until I could gauge the situation for myself. Mom looked up from the stove with genuine surprise when I appeared in the kitchen doorway, her weathered hands still steady as she flipped strips of bacon in the cast-iron skillet she'd used for as long as I could remember. She was smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow, with new lines around her eyes and a slight tremor in her left hand that hadn't been there during my last visit. Her gray hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and she wore the same type of floral house dress that had been her uniform for decades, but something in her expression suggested she hadn't been sleeping well recently. "Sarah," she exclaimed, setting down her spatula and moving toward me with arms outstretched, though I noticed she moved more slowly than usual, favoring her right leg slightly. "What are you doing here, honey? You didn't tell us you were coming." "Home." Her embrace was warm and familiar, smelling of the same white shoulders perfume she'd worn since I was a child, but I could feel how thin she'd become, her shoulder blades prominent beneath the lightweight fabric of her dress. When she pulled back to look at me, I saw something in her eyes, relief, perhaps, or maybe guilt, that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. Dad appeared from the back porch where he'd been retrieving the morning newspaper, a ritual he'd maintained religiously for 40 years, despite the fact that the Spokane paper had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. He seemed genuinely confused to see me standing in his kitchen, and for a moment I wondered if his memory issues were worse than any of us had realized. But then recognition clicked into place, and he smiled the same lopsided grin that had greeted me home from school every day of my childhood, though now it seemed forced, as if he was working to appear normal when everything was anything but normal. "Well, this is a nice surprise," he said, folding his newspaper with hands that shook slightly as he set it on the kitchen table. Rebecca didn't mention you were planning a visit. The way he said my sister's name carried weight, and I caught the meaningful look that passed between my parents. They were communicating in the shorthand of a couple married for 45 years, and I was clearly not privy to whatever message was being exchanged. Dad had always been a big man, broad-shouldered from decades of manual labor, but he seemed to have shrunk in on himself, his flannel shirt hanging loose where it once fit snugly across his chest. I accepted Mom's offer of coffee and bacon, settling into the same chair I'd occupied throughout high school while trying to read the undercurrents of tension that filled the small kitchen. The morning light streaming through the window above the sink illuminated details I'd missed in the darkness. Bills stacked on the counter, a pill organizer with compartments for different days of the week, and a calendar marked with appointments I couldn't read from my position at the table. Everything looked normal on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of stress that made even casual conversation feel loaded with hidden meaning. I had some time off and thought I'd surprise you, I said, which was partially true even if it omitted the real reason for my sudden appearance. It's been too long since I've been home for more than a holiday visit. Mom beamed at this, clearly pleased by what she interpreted as her distant daughter finally making an effort to spend time with family. But Dad continued to study me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle, and I wondered if he suspected that Mrs. Henderson had been talking to the neighbors again. Rebecca's name came up naturally as Mom filled me in on family news. Emma had started second grade and was already reading above grade level. Jake had joined a soccer team and scored his first goal the previous weekend. Tom had gotten a promotion at the electrical supply company where he'd worked since high school. All normal family updates, the kind of information I usually received in Christmas cards or brief phone calls. But today, it felt like Mom was working to fill silence that might otherwise become uncomfortable. She didn't mention anything about banks or paperwork or any business that might have required the whole family to make a trip downtown. Rebecca's been such a help lately, Dad added, stirring sugar into his coffee with careful concentration. Don't know what we'd do without her, especially with all the arrangements we've had to make recently. He paused after the word arrangements, and I felt my pulse quicken. This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the acknowledgement that something significant had been happening in my absence. Mom shot him a warning look, but he either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, continuing to stir his coffee with unnecessary intensity. What kind of arrangements? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the fact that my heart was racing. The question hung in the air for several seconds while my parents exchanged another one of their loaded glances. Mom turned back to the stove, suddenly very busy with breakfast preparations, while Dad seemed to be weighing his words carefully. The kitchen felt smaller than it had moments before, filled with the weight of whatever secret they were keeping. From me? Oh, just some financial planning, Mom said finally, her voice artificially bright as she began setting plates on the table. Nothing you need to worry about, dear. Rebecca's been helping us organize some paperwork, that's all. But the way she avoided eye contact and the slight tremor in her voice told me this was far from the whole truth. I was about to press further when we heard a car door slam in the driveway, followed by familiar footsteps on the front porch. Rebecca had arrived, and from the expression on my parents' faces, my unexpected presence was about to complicate whatever family business they'd been conducting without me. The front door opened with the confidence of someone who didn't need to knock, and Rebecca's voice called out from the living room with barely concealed irritation. Mom, I saw Sarah's car in front of the house. What's she doing here? Her tone carried the same edge it had held during our teenage years when she'd felt that my academic achievements or college plans were somehow disrupting the family equilibrium. I heard her footsteps crossing the hardwood floor of the living room, moving with purpose toward the kitchen where we all sat frozen around the breakfast table, like actors whose play had been interrupted by an unscripted entrance. When Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, I was struck by how much she'd aged since our last encounter at Christmas dinner 8 months earlier. Her blonde hair, once naturally sun-streaked from childhood summers, was now clearly maintained by regular salon visits, and stress lines had appeared around her eyes that makeup couldn't completely conceal. She wore the uniform of suburban mothers everywhere, yoga pants, an oversized sweatshirt, and running shoes that had never been used for actual running, but there was nothing casual about the tension in her posture as she surveyed the scene of our family breakfast. "Hello, Rebecca," I said, rising from my chair in what I hoped was a gesture of peace rather than confrontation. I decided to take some time off and come for a visit. It's good to see you. But even as I spoke the polite words, I could see that my unexpected presence had thrown off whatever plans she'd had for the morning. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like a shield, and I noticed that her knuckles were white with the intensity of her grip. Whatever was in that folder was clearly important, and my being here was clearly a complication she hadn't anticipated. "You should have called first," she said, accepting my awkward hug but keeping her body rigid and her arms at her sides. "We had appointments this morning, things we needed to take care of." Her eyes moved between our parents with the look of someone trying to communicate urgently without speaking directly. Dad had gone back to stirring his coffee with unnecessary concentration, while Mom busied herself with cleaning an already spotless counter. The air in the kitchen felt thick with unspoken tension, and I realized that my arrival had interrupted something significant. Mom tried to lighten the mood by offering Rebecca coffee and breakfast, but my sister declined with the impatience of someone who had more pressing concerns than social niceties. She remained standing while the rest of us sat, creating a physical dynamic that emphasized her role as the family member who was handling business, while the rest of us were simply having breakfast. The manila folder never left her hands, and I found myself fixated on it, wondering what documents could be so important that she'd brought them to what should have been a casual morning visit. "I tried calling you last night," Rebecca said, finally addressing me directly. "3 times. You didn't answer." There was accusation in her voice, as if my failure to respond to calls I hadn't heard had somehow contributed to whatever family crisis was unfolding. I explained about the drive from Seattle and my phone being on silent, but she seemed skeptical, as if she suspected I'd been deliberately avoiding family contact. The truth was that I had been avoiding deeper involvement in family matters, but not out of malice, more out of the comfortable assumption that Rebecca was handling everything that needed handling. "What's so urgent that you needed to reach me last night?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer had something to do with the bank visit Mrs. Henderson had witnessed. Rebecca glanced at our parents again, clearly looking for guidance about how much to reveal in my presence. The fact that they were treating me like an outsider in my own family's business was both hurtful and telling, apparently significant. Decisions had been made without my input or even my knowledge, and my sudden appearance was forcing them to confront the reality of how excluded I'd become. Dad cleared his throat and set down his coffee cup with the deliberate movements of someone preparing to deliver difficult news. "Sarah, there are some things we need to discuss as a family, things that Rebecca has been helping us with and that you have a right to know about." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd been dreading this conversation, and Mom's face had gone pale as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Whatever was about to be revealed was clearly significant enough to have been causing stress for some time. "We've been trying to figure out the best way to handle our situation," Mom added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca thought it might be better to wait until everything was finalized before involving you, since you're so busy with your career and your life in Seattle." The way she said "your life in Seattle" made it sound like a foreign country rather than a city 300 miles away. And I realized that my family had been making major decisions based on the assumption that I was too distant, too busy, or too uninterested to be consulted. Rebecca finally moved away from the doorway and took a seat at the table, setting the manila folder down in front of her with careful precision. "The house," she said simply, as if those 2 words explained everything. "It's about the house, Sarah, and Dad's care and Mom's medical expenses, and the fact that their Social Security and Dad's pension aren't enough to cover everything anymore." Her voice was steady but strained, and I could see that she'd been carrying the weight of these concerns alone for longer than any of us had realized. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window suddenly felt harsh and unforgiving as the magnitude of what she was saying began to sink in. This wasn't just about organizing paperwork or helping with appointments. This was about financial crisis, about medical needs that exceeded their resources, about decisions that would affect the fundamental structure of our family. I looked around the kitchen that had been the center of my childhood world, seeing it now through the lens of necessity rather than nostalgia, and wondered how long this crisis had been building while I was focused on quarterly reports and client meetings 300 miles away. Rebecca opened the manila folder with the careful movements of someone handling evidence in a court case, and I could see that it contained multiple sets of documents, each section marked with colored tabs that suggested extensive organization and preparation. The top document was a deed transfer form from First National Bank, and even reading it upside down from across the table, I could make out my parents' names alongside Rebecca's in neat, legal typescript. My stomach dropped as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about financial planning or organizing paperwork. This was about transferring ownership of the family home that had been my parents' primary asset for over 30 years. They needed someone to co-sign for a reverse mortgage, Rebecca said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a prepared explanation. The medical bills from Mom's hip surgery last year, Dad's prescriptions, and the property taxes had gotten ahead of their monthly income. The bank required a family member to be added to the deed before they would approve the loan modification. She spoke matter-of-factly, but I could see tension in the way she held her shoulders, as if she was bracing for my reaction to information she'd clearly hoped to handle without my involvement. Dad looked smaller in his chair as Rebecca spoke, and I realized that the proud man who had worked double shifts to pay for this house, who had spent weekends maintaining every inch of the property, was now dependent on his daughters to navigate financial arrangements he couldn't manage alone. "We didn't want to burden you," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Rebecca was already helping with so much, and you have your own life to worry about. We thought it would be simpler to keep it in the family without dragging you away from your job for something we could handle ourselves." But as Rebecca continued explaining the arrangement, it became clear that handling it themselves had involved making me completely absent from decisions that would affect our entire family's future. The reverse mortgage would allow my parents to stay in the house while accessing its equity to pay for mounting medical expenses, but it also meant that Rebecca was now a co-owner with significant control over what happened to the property. The bank had required someone with stable employment and good credit to guarantee the arrangement, qualifications that Rebecca met through her husband's steady job and their conservative financial management. "When did this all start?" I asked, trying to keep accusation out of my voice while my mind raced through months of brief phone calls and holiday visits where no one had mentioned financial problems or medical crises serious enough to require mortgaging the house. Mom twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had since I was a child, while Dad seemed to be studying the grain pattern in the kitchen table with unusual intensity. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Rebecca finally answered, consulting a small notebook she'd pulled from her purse. "Mom's hip surgery was in March," she said, flipping through handwritten pages that suggested she'd been keeping detailed records of medical appointments and expenses. The insurance covered most of it, but the rehabilitation and follow-up care added up to more than they had in savings. Then Dad had that episode in June where we thought he might be having mini-strokes. And the testing and specialist visits were expensive, even with Medicare. Each item on her list felt like another weight added to my chest as I realized how much family crisis I'd missed while focused on my own life. The episode in June was news to me entirely. No one had mentioned Dad having any kind of medical scare, let alone something serious enough to require specialists and extensive testing. "What episode?" I asked, looking between my parents for an explanation that would help me understand how I'd remained so completely uninformed about my father's health. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and Dad's hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years. "He got confused at the grocery store," Mom said softly. "Couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Mrs. Patterson from the church found him in the parking lot, just standing by the car with the keys in his hand, looking lost." Her voice broke slightly as she described the incident, and I could see how frightened she'd been by this glimpse of what the future might hold. The doctors ran tests for everything: stroke, dementia, vitamin deficiencies, but they couldn't find anything definitive. They said it might have been stress or medication interactions, but we needed to be prepared for the possibility that it could happen again. Rebecca had been the one to take Dad to all the follow-up appointments, to research specialists and navigate insurance authorizations, to sit with Mom in waiting rooms while test results were discussed and treatment options were explained. She'd been the one making lists of medications and symptoms, keeping track of co-payments and deductibles, managing the practical realities of aging parents while I remained safely distant in Seattle. The weight of my absence from these crucial months felt crushing as I realized how much my family had been dealing with while I attended client dinners and worried about marketing campaigns. The reverse mortgage seemed like the best option, Rebecca continued, her voice taking on a defensive edge. It allows them to stay in the house, covers the medical expenses, and provides a buffer for future emergencies. The bank required a co-signer, and since I was already handling their finances, she trailed off. But the implication was clear. She was the daughter who was present, who was responsible, who was trusted to make difficult decisions when they needed to be made. I stared at the deed transfer document, seeing my parents' shaky signatures next to Rebecca's confident handwriting, and felt like I was looking at evidence of my own failure as a daughter. While I'd been building my career and enjoying the independence of city life, my family had been navigating a crisis that would reshape their future, and they'd done it without me because I'd made myself unavailable in every way that mattered. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock that had marked the rhythm of family meals throughout my childhood, and I wondered if there was any way to repair the damage my absence had caused. The silence in the kitchen stretched until it became unbearable, punctuated only by Mom's quiet sniffling and the sound of Dad drumming his fingers nervously against his coffee mug. I felt as though I was seeing my family clearly for the first time in years, not as the stable, self-sufficient unit I'd imagined from my comfortable distance in Seattle, but as aging people struggling with health crises and financial pressures, while trying to maintain their dignity and independence. Rebecca had been carrying burdens that should have been shared among all of us, and my parents had been making life-altering decisions based on the assumption that their successful daughter was too busy or too important to be bothered with their problems. I should have been here, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper as the full weight of my absence hit me. You should have called me about Dad's episode, about the medical bills, about all of it. I'm part of this family too, even if I haven't been acting like it lately. The words felt inadequate to express the guilt and regret that was washing over me, but they were the only ones I could find. Mom looked up from her tissue with eyes that were both grateful and sad, as if she'd been waiting months to hear me acknowledge what my distance had cost all of us. Rebecca's expression softened slightly, though I could still see years of resentment in the way she held her shoulders. You were 300 miles away, Sarah. You have your job, your life, your own responsibilities. We didn't want to burden you with problems you couldn't solve from Seattle anyway. But even as she spoke the reasonable words, I could hear the underlying hurt. The feeling that I'd chosen my career over my family, that I'd been content to let her handle the difficult parts of daughterhood, while I enjoyed the freedom of geographic distance. But these aren't problems I couldn't help. Solve, I protested, gesturing toward the stack of financial documents. I have savings, I have resources, I could have helped with the medical bills or found other options besides mortgaging the house. Even as I said it, though, I realized that my offer of help was coming too late. The decisions had been made, the papers had been signed, and the house where I'd grown up was no longer solely my parents' property. Rebecca was now legally entitled to make decisions about their living situation, and I was the outsider who had shown up after the fact. Dad cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time since Rebecca had arrived, his blue eyes still sharp despite his recent health scares. Sarah, honey, we appreciate that you want to help now, but we needed help 6 months ago when your mother was in rehabilitation and I was having those spells. Rebecca was here, taking time off work, to drive us to appointments, organizing our medications, dealing with insurance companies while you were... He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. While you were busy with your own life. The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow, and I realized that my family's exclusion of me from major decisions hadn't been arbitrary or spiteful. It had been logical, based on my own pattern of prioritizing everything else over them. I thought about all the times I'd cut phone conversations short because of work calls, all the weekends I'd skipped visiting because of social obligations or simple inertia, all the ways I'd signaled that my Seattle life was more important than staying connected to the people who had raised me. The reverse mortgage isn't necessarily a bad thing, Rebecca continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining complex information to a child. Mom and Dad get to stay in their home, they have access to funds for medical expenses, and the house stays in the family. When they're gone, I'll be able to sell it and use the proceeds for Emma and Jake's college funds. It actually worked out better than trying to liquidate assets or take out traditional loans they couldn't qualify for on their fixed income. But as she outlined the practical benefits of the arrangement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. Rebecca wasn't just helping anymore. She was making decisions, holding legal authority, positioning herself as the primary caregiver and beneficiary, while I remained on the periphery. The house that had been our shared childhood home was now essentially hers, and my parents' financial security was tied to her continued involvement in ways that made my potential contributions less relevant. What happens if Mom and Dad need more care than they can manage at home? I asked, trying to understand the long-term implications of the arrangement. What if Dad's memory issues get worse, or Mom needs more surgery? Are you prepared to handle all of that on your own? My questions weren't entirely altruistic. I was also trying to figure out where I fit into a family structure that seemed to have reorganized itself around my absence. Rebecca's jaw tightened, and I could see that she'd been thinking about these possibilities for months while trying to manage everything herself. I'm handling it the same way I've been handling everything else, one day at a time, with help from Tom and the kids when they can provide it. It's not ideal, but it's what we have to work with given the choices that were made. The emphasis on choices that were made was clearly directed at me, a reminder that my decision to build a life away from family had consequences that extended beyond my own experience. The kitchen felt smaller and more claustrophobic as the conversation continued, filled with years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding. I wanted to argue that I'd never intended to abandon my family, that career success had been something I'd pursued for all of us. That distance didn't mean I cared less about their well-being. But the evidence was stacked against me in the form of medical crises I'd missed, financial problems I'd been unaware of, and legal documents that had been signed without my knowledge or input. I was the daughter who had been absent when it mattered most, and all the good intentions in the world couldn't change that reality. The weight of everything I'd learned sat heavy on my chest as I excused myself from the kitchen table and stepped out onto the back porch where Dad used to smoke his evening pipe, and Mom would sit shelling peas from her garden. The small backyard looked as neglected as the front lawn, with flower beds that had once been Mom's pride now overgrown with weeds, and the vegetable garden reduced to a few struggling tomato plants. It was clear that my parents' declining health had affected their ability to maintain the property that had been their primary source of pride and investment for decades. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my banking app, calculating exactly how much I could contribute to my parents' care without jeopardizing my own financial security. My savings account held enough to cover several months of their expenses, and my 401k had grown substantially over the past few years of aggressive investing. But as I ran the numbers, I realized that my money alone wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. My parents needed ongoing care and support, not just financial assistance. And Rebecca had positioned herself as the person providing that care, while I remained geographically and emotionally distant. When I returned to the kitchen, I found my family engaged in what appeared to be a tense discussion about scheduling and appointments, with Rebecca consulting her notebook and my parents looking overwhelmed by the complexity of managing their own lives. "I want to help," I announced, interrupting their conversation about physical therapy schedules and prescription refills. "I know I haven't been present the way I should have been, but I'm here now, and I want to figure out how to make this work better for everyone." Rebecca looked up from her notes with undisguised skepticism. "Help how, exactly? Are you planning to move back to Spokane? Take time off work to drive them to doctor appointments? Because those are the kinds of help they actually need, not just good intentions from someone who visits twice a year." Her words stung because they were accurate. My offer to help was vague and probably temporary, while her commitment had been demonstrated through months of actual presence and practical assistance. "I could take a leave of absence," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure I meant them. "My company has family medical leave policies, and I have savings that could cover my expenses for several months. Maybe it's time I stopped treating my family like they were optional parts of my life." But Rebecca's expression remained doubtful, and I couldn't blame her for questioning whether I would follow through on promises that seemed to emerge from guilt rather than genuine commitment. Dad had been listening to our exchange with the expression of someone watching a tennis match, his head turning between Rebecca and me as we negotiated over his care as if he wasn't sitting right there. "Girls," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had settled family disputes throughout our childhood. "I appreciate that you both want to help, but your mother and I are still capable of making our own decisions. We agreed to the mortgage arrangement because it seemed like the best option available to us at the time, but that doesn't mean we're ready to hand over all control of our lives." Mom nodded emphatically, though I could see the exhaustion in her face that suggested managing their independence was becoming increasingly difficult. "We just want to stay in our home as long as possible, continue taking care of ourselves, and not be a burden on either of you girls. The house arrangement gives us some financial breathing room, and Rebecca has been wonderful about helping when we need it, but we're not invalids yet." Her voice carried determination, but I could also hear the fear underneath, the worry that acknowledging how much help they needed would mean losing the independence they'd worked their whole lives to maintain. Rebecca began gathering her papers with movements that suggested she was preparing to leave, and I realized that my unexpected arrival had disrupted whatever routine they'd established for managing family business. "I have to get Emma to soccer practice," she said. Though I suspected the real reason for her departure was the need to process this conversation away from family dynamics that had suddenly become more complicated. "Mom, Dad, I'll call you tonight about the appointment with Dr. Peterson on Thursday. And Sarah," she paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "If you're serious about wanting to help, we should probably sit down and figure out what that actually means." After Rebecca left, the house felt different, quieter but also more tense, as if her departure had left behind unresolved questions about how our family would navigate the changing dynamics of aging parents and adult children with different levels of involvement. I helped Mom clear the breakfast dishes while Dad retreated to his recliner with the newspaper, but I could feel both of them watching me, trying to gauge whether my sudden interest in family affairs was genuine or simply a reaction to being excluded from major decisions. "Your sister has been under a lot of stress," Mom said quietly as we worked together at the sink, her words careful and diplomatic. "Tom's been wonderful, but it's been hard on their marriage, having to spend so much time here instead of focusing on their own family. And the kids barely see their mother some weeks because she's always running errands for us or taking us to appointments." I could hear the guilt in her voice, the recognition that their increasing needs were affecting not just Rebecca but her entire family. "I should have been sharing that responsibility," I admitted, scrubbing a plate with more intensity than necessary. "I should have been paying attention to what was happening instead of assuming everyone was fine, just because no one complained to me about it." The admission felt both overdue and inadequate, but it was the beginning of acknowledging how my comfortable distance had contributed to the current situation. As we finished cleaning up, I found myself looking around the kitchen with new eyes, noticing details I'd missed during previous visits. The pill organizer on the counter, the magnifying glass next to Mom's crossword puzzles, the grab bar that had been installed next to the stove. These were the signs of aging and adaptation that I'd somehow overlooked, evidence that my parents had been quietly managing increasing limitations while trying to maintain their independence and dignity. The house that had seemed unchanged during my holiday visits was actually full of modifications and accommodations that told the story of people learning to live with bodies that were becoming less reliable. The morning had transformed from a simple family visit into a reckoning with years of choices and consequences, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what came next. But as I stood in the kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast every day of my childhood, surrounded by the people who had shaped my entire understanding of love and responsibility, I knew that running back to Seattle wasn't an option anymore. Whatever came next, whatever difficult conversations and practical arrangements lay ahead, I was finally ready to be present for my family in ways I'd been avoiding for far too long. That afternoon, while my parents napped in their respective chairs, Dad in his recliner facing the television, Mom on the living room couch with an Afghan pulled up to her chin, I found myself alone in the house for the first time since arriving. The silence felt different from the comfortable quiet of my Seattle apartment. It was heavy with decades of family history and the recent tension of unresolved conversations. I walked through rooms that had remained virtually unchanged since my high school years, seeing them now through the lens of practical concerns rather than nostalgic memory. The bathroom off the main hallway had been modified with safety equipment I'd never noticed before: a raised toilet seat, grab bars around the bathtub, and a shower chair that suggested Mom's mobility issues were more significant than she'd let on during our phone conversations. The medicine cabinet was packed with prescription bottles, many of them bearing Dad's name, and dates that revealed his health problems had been ongoing for months. Each small adaptation told a story of gradual decline and determined independence, of two people working to maintain their routines while their bodies became less cooperative. In the kitchen, I opened cabinets and drawers with the curiosity of someone seeing familiar spaces through adult eyes. The refrigerator was covered with appointment cards, phone numbers for medical providers, and a schedule that showed Rebecca's handwriting coordinating their various needs throughout each week. The freezer contained mostly prepared meals, the kind designed for seniors who could no longer manage extensive cooking, rather than the homemade casseroles and carefully wrapped leftovers that had defined Mom's approach to meal planning throughout my childhood. I called my supervisor in Seattle to extend my family leave request, explaining that the situation was more complex than I'd initially realized, and that I needed at least 2 weeks to help sort things out. Jennifer was understanding but direct about the implications for my current projects, and I could hear the professional disappointment in her voice as she agreed to redistribute my responsibilities among other team members. The conversation reinforced how completely I'd compartmentalized my family and professional lives, keeping them separate in ways that had allowed me to avoid exactly this kind of conflict between competing obligations. When Rebecca returned that evening after her children's activities, she found me at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in notes and calculations, trying to map out options for better supporting our parents while addressing the financial and logistical realities we were facing. She accepted my offer of coffee and sat across from me with the expression of someone prepared for another difficult conversation, but perhaps slightly more open to collaboration than she'd been that morning. "I've been thinking about what you said about help," I began, showing her the lists I'd made of potential resources and approaches. "You're right that I can't just throw money at this problem and expect it to solve everything. But there are things I can contribute that might make the situation more sustainable for everyone." I'd researched local senior services, investigated private care options, and calculated how my financial resources could be used most effectively to supplement the reverse mortgage arrangement rather than trying to replace it. Rebecca studied my notes with the careful attention of someone who'd been managing these same concerns alone for months. "Some of this could work," she admitted, pointing to my research on adult day programs and respite care services. "But the waiting lists are long, and Mom and Dad are resistant to accepting help from strangers. They barely agreed to let me coordinate their care, and that took months of gradual involvement before they trusted me to handle their appointments and medications." We spent the next 2 hours creating a more comprehensive plan that acknowledged both my desire to contribute and the reality that effective caregiving required consistent presence rather than sporadic intervention. I agreed to spend 2 weeks in Spokane helping to establish better systems for managing their care, then transition to monthly weekend visits while handling certain responsibilities remotely, coordinating with insurance companies, researching treatment options, and managing the financial aspects of their care that could be done from Seattle. "The hardest part isn't the logistics," Rebecca said as we worked through the details. "It's watching them lose their independence gradually, seeing Dad get confused or watching Mom struggle with tasks that used to be automatic for her. And it's the guilt of knowing that helping them means taking time away from my own family, but also knowing that no one else was stepping up to handle it." Her voice carried years of frustration, but also the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a burden alone for too long. I found myself thinking about the different ways we'd each responded to the reality of aging parents. Rebecca by increasing her involvement and taking on more responsibility, me by maintaining distance and focusing on my own life goals. Neither approach had been consciously chosen, but both had shaped our family's current situation in ways that were proving difficult to navigate. The arrangement she'd made with the reverse mortgage was practical and necessary, but it had also established her as the primary decision-maker in ways that would be difficult to change. "I need you to understand something," Rebecca said as we prepared to present our revised plan to our parents the next morning. "This isn't just about dividing up responsibilities or making schedules. Mom and Dad have gotten used to depending on me, and they trust me to make decisions because I've proven I'll be here when things get difficult. If you're going to be part of this, you have to be reliable in ways you haven't been before, even when it's inconvenient or conflicts with your other priorities." Her words were fair but challenging, asking me to commit to a level of family involvement that would require fundamental changes in how I'd been living my life. The comfortable distance I'd maintained between Seattle and Spokane had allowed me to avoid exactly these kinds of ongoing responsibilities, but it had also left my family to manage a crisis without resources I could have provided. Whatever arrangement we worked out going forward would need to address not just practical concerns, but also the trust that had been damaged by my absence during the months when they'd needed help most. As we turned off the kitchen lights and prepared for another night in the house where we'd both grown up, I realized that the hardest part of the conversation still lay ahead. Our parents would need to agree to accept help from both of us, to trust that I would follow through on commitments I was making, and to navigate the changing dynamics of a family learning to balance independence with the reality of increasing needs. The morning would bring decisions that couldn't be undone, and conversations that would shape how we managed the years ahead as our parents continued aging and requiring more support than any one person could reasonably provide. The sunrise filtering through the kitchen window found all four of us gathered around the breakfast table again, but this time the manila folder sat closed between Rebecca and me while we presented our collaborative plan to parents who looked both hopeful and apprehensive about changes to routines they'd been struggling to maintain. Dad's hands were steadier this morning, and Mom had taken extra care with her appearance, suggesting they understood this conversation would be significant for their future independence and security. "We've worked out a way for both of us to help," I began, looking between my parents' faces for signs of receptiveness or resistance. "Rebecca will continue coordinating your day-to-day care and appointments, but I'll handle the insurance paperwork, research new treatment options, and visit regularly to help with larger projects around the house. We think this approach will give you more support without making you feel like you're losing control of your own lives." The plan we'd developed balanced my need to contribute meaningfully with Rebecca's established role as primary caregiver, while acknowledging our parents' desire to maintain as much independence as possible. Mom reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite the arthritis that had been causing her pain. "We appreciate that you want to help, Sarah, but we don't want you to sacrifice your career or your life in Seattle for us. You've worked hard to build something good for yourself, and we're proud of what you've accomplished." Her words carried both gratitude and concern, the complex emotions of a mother who wanted her daughter's involvement, but worried about the cost of that involvement. Rebecca opened the folder and spread out a revised schedule that showed how we could coordinate our efforts more effectively, with my monthly visits timed to coincide with major medical appointments and home maintenance tasks that required more physical capability than our parents could manage. "The reverse mortgage gives you financial stability," she explained, "and this plan gives you family support without overwhelming any one person. Sarah's skills with paperwork and research will help us navigate the healthcare system more effectively, and my local presence means someone is always available for emergencies." Dad studied our proposal with the careful attention he'd once brought to engineering problems at the aluminum plant, asking practical questions about timing and logistics that showed his mind was still sharp when it came to solving concrete problems. "This could work," he said finally, "but only if everyone understands that your mother and I make the final decisions about our own care. We appreciate help, but we're not ready to hand over control of our lives to anyone, even our daughters, who mean well." The conversation that followed was the most honest and comprehensive discussion our family had shared in years, covering everything from financial concerns to end-of-life preferences, from daily care needs to long-term planning, for scenarios none of us wanted to contemplate. We talked about what would happen if Dad's memory issues worsened, about Mom's fear of becoming completely dependent on others, about Rebecca's stress and my guilt, and the ways both emotions had shaped our responses to family crisis. By late morning, we'd established a framework that felt sustainable for everyone involved: regular communication, shared responsibilities, and respect for our parents' autonomy even as their needs increased. I would return to Seattle to arrange extended leave from work, then come back to spend 2 weeks helping establish better systems for managing their care. After that, I'd visit monthly while handling remote responsibilities that played to my organizational strengths and professional experience. "There's something else we need to discuss," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the serious tone that had marked our most difficult conversations. "The house will eventually need to be sold to pay back the reverse mortgage, and when that happens, Emma and Jake's college funds will benefit from the proceeds. But Sarah, you'll always have a claim to half of whatever equity remains, and any financial contributions you make now should be documented so they're recognized later." She was addressing the elephant in the room, the reality that our parents' financial crisis had implications for inheritance and family wealth that we'd never discussed openly. I waved off her concern about documenting my contributions, but she insisted on the importance of keeping clear records to prevent future family conflicts. "We're all making sacrifices to help Mom and Dad," she said. "Mine are mostly time and convenience. Yours are mostly financial and career-related. But we should make sure everything is fair and transparent so there are no misunderstandings later." Her insistence on fairness touched me, suggesting that despite our tensions, she wanted our collaboration to be built on mutual respect rather than unspoken resentments. As we prepared for me to return to Seattle to arrange my extended leave, I found myself looking around the house with different eyes, not as the childhood home I'd been nostalgic about, but as the current residence of two aging people who were working to maintain their independence while their children learned to balance support with respect for their autonomy. The refrigerator schedules, the bathroom grab bars, the pill organizers were no longer signs of decline, but evidence of adaptation and determination. My parents walked me to the car as I prepared to drive back to Seattle, and the goodbye felt different from the casual farewells that had marked the end of previous visits. "Thank you for coming home," Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "And thank you for working things out with Rebecca. We've been worried about how the two of you would handle things when we're not here anymore, and seeing you collaborate gives us hope that you'll take care of each other." The drive back to Seattle provided 4 hours to process everything that had changed in the past few days. My understanding of my parents' situation, my relationship with Rebecca, and my own priorities and responsibilities. The mountains and valleys that had seemed familiar during my anxious drive east just days earlier now felt like the landscape of a different person's life, someone who had been comfortable maintaining distance from family obligations that were becoming impossible to ignore. Back in my apartment, I spent the evening on the phone with HR representatives and project managers, arranging the extended leave that would allow me to be present for my family in ways I'd been avoiding for years. The conversations were professional and straightforward, but they represented a fundamental shift in how I would balance career ambitions with family responsibilities going forward. As I packed for an extended stay in Spokane, I realized that the comfortable compartmentalization of my adult life was ending, replaced by the more complex reality of being fully present for the people who had shaped me, even when that presence required sacrifices I hadn't previously been willing to make. The next morning, as I loaded my car for the return trip to Spokane, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving home for college. The sense that I was moving towards something important rather than away from something I wanted to escape. My family was facing challenges that would only increase with time, but for the first time in years, we were facing them together, with honest communication and shared responsibility replacing the distance and assumptions that had nearly torn us apart. The road ahead would be difficult, but it would be traveled with the support and love that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop running long enough to recognize it.